My conversation today is with accomplished scholar, author, lecturer, and practitioner Richard Kazcynski. Richard has been a significant contributor to the study and modern elucidation of Western ceremonial magic and its history. Some of his works include Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, Panic in Detroit, The Magician in the Motor City, Forgotten Templars, The Untold Origins of the Ordo Templi Orientis, and more recently, Friendship and Doubt, Aleister Crowley, J.F.C. Fuller, Victor Newberg, and British Agnosticism, and Mind Over Magic, The Psychology of Ritual Magic. An absolute font of wonderful esotericism and obscure histories, it was an honor to sit down with Richard and discuss everything from Western ceremonial to the psychology of magic to our favorite prog rock artists. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. This is excellent. I'm so happy that you've joined me here this evening. Scholar, author, ceremonialist, Richard Kazcynski. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have a chance to sit down and catch up a little bit after all the fuss from Mystic South has died down.
That was a lot of fun. We represented North Carolina, I think. That was pretty good.
Very well, yes.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed your piece. It was one of the few that I got to see because I was actually really I was presenting at multiple things, but I feel very, very fortunate to have caught your presentation. We'll get into that a little later, but I guess for people like you and I have just met, obviously, if you're involved in the occult in any real kind of way that's more than just dipping your toe in, you've heard of your name. We've heard of your books. Very, very strong presence in the scholarly and the practical communities, which is, I love that. That's the sweet spot. But I still don't even really know too much about how you got started. You told me one story that I really liked. I'm interested to see if that is also incorporated into this kind of little background on you.
Well, if not, you'll have to bring it up so I can tell that. But
Yeah.
yeah, basically what happened, I mean, and I've been reflecting on this quite a lot because I kind of feel like the time I grew up, which was in the 70s, was just inundated with information about the occult. I mean, not only was there things like the television program In Search Of, which was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. And of course, as a little Trekkie kid, I had to watch, Mr. Spock's show, which was kind of a doorway into all of this. But there was, I remember I grew up in Detroit, so we had cable, Canadian, I should say, television, as well as, US television. One of the shows that we had was this program called Beyond Reason, which was kind of a metaphysical What's My Line, where we had a palm reader, an astrologer, and a clairvoyant, who had like a personal possession, each of which had 60 seconds to try and guess who the special guest of honor was. But there was, the Man, Myth, and Magic magazines. I remember picking up Francis King and Stephen Skinner's Techniques of High Magic at like the local grocery store and made my mom buy it for me, and it just seemed like it was everywhere. Um, but I don't think that's the explanation because obviously everyone of my generation did not turn out to be an occultist. But there was something about that just grabbed my attention. And at one point, I discovered there was a metaphysical bookshop that was about a 4 or 5 mile bicycle ride from my house. So I rode up there and dropped my first, $5 or whatever on a copy of the Complete Prophecies of Nostradamus, which was kind of opened the door because when I went back 2 weeks later, my next purchase was Israel Regardie's The Golden Dawn, and then it was off to the races from there. But something, I don't know, something about those times and me living in those times was just like the perfect storm. And I often feel like I didn't so much choose this path as my circumstances and my environment kind of grab
Mhm.
me by the shoulders and kick me in the fanny, to move me down that path.
Yeah, yeah, and I remember you even getting some help from the locals, and yeah, that bookstore owner that you were telling me about the last time we got together.
Yeah, yeah, it was his name was Paul Hudson, and the bookstore was called the Middle Earth Bookshop. And after I came back again a couple of weeks later, after having bought Israel Regardie's The Golden Dawn, he asked me, "Oh, well, what'd you think about that?" And I thought, "Oh, I thought it was really awesome." And so he said, "Well, if you really enjoyed that, you should really read this." And he pulled off the shelf the black Dover paperback edition of Aleister Crowley's Magic and Theory and Practice. And I took that home and I started reading it, and I got to the end of like the introduction, and at the end, Crowley, ends the introduction with "Witness mine hand," and there's all this stuff, and knowing now what that was, it was his various magical mottos and degrees and things like that. But at that time, I had no idea what that was, and I was perplexed and mystified, but also very curious, and I was bound and determined to figure out what this was. And for some reason, Paul Hudson took me under his wing and saw something. I don't know what it was, but he encouraged me to, pursue my interests when I realized that understanding Magic Theory and Practice also required reading Aleister Crowley's The Equinox, which was this 10-volume set of books, or 11 if you count the Blue Equinox.
Mm.
Um, Crowley is very self-referential. He tends to say, well, as I wrote in this thing and in that thing and this unpublished thing in this other place. And it's like this web you have to kind of unpack and untangle. I went, to the bookstore and said, wow, I really want to track down a set of these books. And he told me, well, that just so happens I got a used set. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. How much is it? And he said, oh, it's $100. And I went, wow, that's, too rich for my blood. I'm just this 14-year-old kid. I get $5 a week for allowance. I don't have $100. And so he said, listen, I'll tell you what, I'll set this aside for you and you can come by and I'll sell you one volume at a time for $10. And that's exactly what I did. So every 2 weeks I took my allowance, and pedaled up there, bought my volume of Equinox every 2 weeks. And after I bought, the ninth number, he gave me the 10th for free as a gift, and said, "There you go." And so my set of the Equinox, the Wiser reprint from 1974 or whatever, cost me $90. But again, what it was that possessed him to just kind of say, "Hey, I'll work with you," because he didn't have a tolerance for a lot of the other kids that would come around the bookstore and kind of, "Oh, let's go look at the Tantra books." He chased them out, but he was like, "Hey, what do you need? How can I help you?" And
Mm.
I don't think I'd be here today if it wasn't for that.
Yeah, and there's something, well, first of all, it's just such a charming story. But um there's something about that, you talking about just mentioning, because I'm not sure that you mentioned that this last piece when we were in person, but you talked about how the self-referentiality of Crowley made it like this kind of web. And it reminds me of one of the things that initially interested myself in occultism was this enigma, this puzzle, and the quest for something. So I'm wondering if that dovetailed into, your scholarly immersion into this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I really think so. The appeal to me was this puzzle to solve. And I think as a professional, I work as a statistician, and in a very similar way, every time I'm given a set of data to analyze, to a question to answer, it is solving a puzzle. It's like, wow, how do I tease apart? How do I use this information to get at the question that I'm being asked, and what's the best way to do it? And again, that was also the case with Crowley. And I think for some people, they want the answers to come a little bit easier, but for me, the idea of a quest, in the Dungeons and Dragons sense, which I was also into at that time, a quest was very appealing, a puzzle to solve, and just this idea of the great unknown. I had this feeling that we had explored the world. We were sending satellites into space. There was what was left there to explore. But oh, hey, there's all the astral planes or your psyche, the inner world, and that was a whole untapped universe, and that to me was very exciting, a place to explore and see what's going on.
Mm. Yeah, and do you think that there were other things, other factors? I mean, there had to have been that drew you with such an intensity specifically towards Crowley's work. I mean, obviously, did you enjoy, the bit of controversy or his unique voice? I mean, for all perhaps my misgivings about the character of Crowley, you cannot, it's undeniable he had a completely unique voice in that field. So I'm wondering what
Hmm.
made you really fall in love with his work.
I just think there was a certain actual beauty to the underlying philosophy. And I think a lot of people come to Crowley because, they feel, oh, sex and drugs, and, I'm going to, blow up the Golden Dawn and reveal all their secrets, and start my own cult, or my own group. And when in reality, when you get into what was happening in Crowley's life and where he was coming from, that was not the case. And I don't know, I guess having read enough Crowley and then reading the biographies that were available at that time, I could tell that the story I was being fed was a lot of bullshit. And, because to me, we know what I was taking away from Crowley is this idea that, we're in this initiatory path. The idea is to become an enlightened being, the best version of ourselves, to attain the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And if we advance far enough, we participate in, the spiritual evolution of mankind as a whole. And these ideas that were central to Thelema of, the idea that you have this true will, this whether it's your true nature, your purpose in this incarnation, what have you, but that we're using these tools of self-reflection and self-discovery to find out why we are in this world as part of this big machine, and to become that thing that we're meant to become. And one of the phrases from Crowley's Book of the Law, which is his channeled text for the religion of Thelema, that I come back to over and over again, is this idea where he talks about I'm divided for love's sake, for the chance of union. And that spoke to my sense of this Buddhist studies I was going through at that time as well. The idea that, and in Hinduism, this idea that everything in the world is all one, but this idea of separation between things is Maya, is illusion, and that's the cause of suffering and reincarnation and whatnot. And this idea that Maya, or this illusion of separation, as the cause of suffering, stood in great contrast to this Thelemic view, saying, no, I'm divided for love's sake. Yes, the separation sucks, but reuniting with the things that you're divided from is pure joy. And that was just such a like a positive idea that I think, again, I fell, as you say, I fell in love with this philosophy.
Yeah, and I think that love shines through. And so that's kind of what initially attracted me to begin to think about, opening up a dialogue between myself and Thelemic practitioners and people who are just better educated on than I am on specifically on Crowley. You don't have to agree with somebody to understand that people in the modern day are have found something there and are using it for the unfoldment of themselves. And I look at, yourself and Lynn and the work that you guys do and just the type of people that you are, even just meeting you topically, it's extremely encouraging. And I'm really happy that you're willing to have these kinds of conversations with me. As I mentioned to you, earlier, I do feel like I have a lot to learn in this area. So I'm glad to have you to kind of show the way to those of us who didn't really get the full picture, right? Which is important. I think I read his Was his some of his journal entries around the time that the Golden Dawn was imploding? That
Hmm.
might have corresponded to when he was at Boleskine. Um, I did hear a very sincere and endearing voice in those journals. Obviously, very frustrated, but there was something that really, really resonated with myself. It made me think of what I had been through and the disillusion I had suffered early on in my magical career that he was very clearly going through with the Golden Dawn. So yeah, that human element I think is super important, and it's not always we don't always some people habitually will dehumanize particular characters in these fields.
Yeah, and I think the idea of humanizing is an important one because one of the things I found interesting about Crowley was that he just kept these, extensive diaries throughout his life and an extensive correspondence. And I think anybody whose life you go through from, tip to tail, you're going to find times where they were less than stellar, despite their best efforts. And Crowley laid that all out for us. And I don't think we have to buy everything or accept everything about Crowley to recognize that there were some worthwhile things that he had to say. And my goal in writing his biography, Perdurabo, was not so much to try to make a hero out of him or to lionize him in any way, but to address my feelings that I mentioned of a lot of the books were kind of bullshit. They were sensational. They were meant to shock. The author was trying to tell you what you should think and editorializing. And I just wanted to collect the facts and tell the story and trust my reader to be smart enough to make their own decision about what they thought of him. And whether you like him or not, that's fine. Just make an informed, decision about that. And I kind of find that regardless of whether you like Crowley or not, he unmistakably lived an incredible life. I mean, that the magical stuff, the poetry, the mountain climbing, the spy stuff, just he lived like multiple lifetimes at the same time, and that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is a little bit of a selfish question. What did you think of an honest appraisal of the tone or the perspective of the eye in the triangle?
I gotta say, I kind of felt like, from what I gathered, Crowley was really hard on Regardie, and maybe it was some tough love he was trying to do, but it was kind of excessively tough love. And I kind of feel like Regardie was almost overly apologizing for Crowley,
Ah, okay, okay. I didn't.
and so while Regardie paints this glowing picture of Crowley, I think it's almost too much on the other side.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's good to know, actually. That's because that was the biography that I think I consumed the most thoroughly on him up to this point. But
But it's valuable because it's somebody who actually spent time with him, and having that personal perspective is valuable. I mean, from my perspective of Crowley, I mean, I'm relying on, again, his letters, his diaries, what he wrote, and what other people said about him, but it's all secondhand. So it's
Mhm.
me filling in, the blanks or drawing conclusions based on the available data. But, we don't know what we don't know.
Mm,
And, and what that in-person interaction might have been like, and obviously we, want to do the best we can, but the perspective of someone who actually knew Crowley is great. Unfortunately, by the time I started writing Perdurabo, most of the people who knew Crowley had already passed. So there was just a handful of people. There was like Christina Foyle, who ran Foyle's bookshops and had Crowley come in and do a lecture. There was Kenneth Grant and just, a couple of other people that were still around and kicking at that time. So I
mm.
was I was lucky to at least get their perspectives.
Well, yeah, that must have been a miniature adventure in and of itself.
Yeah.
I can't imagine. But I do want to talk a little bit about the new book that you've got coming out, Mind Over Magic, the psychology of ritual magic. I'm wondering if you'd be able to tell us a little bit about that and is this for you? Are you of the approach that magic is more psychological, or is there a middle ground? What's how do you treat of that in the book?
I'll start off by saying I think it's there's a middle ground. I'm not trying to say that everything you're doing in psychology is in magic is psychological, but as a psychologist myself, um, I recognize that everything we do involves psychology in some way or another. And so my goal here is just to kind of recognize the role that psychology plays in what we do as ceremonial magicians. And regardless, and I define ceremonial magician in a very broad way. I mean, that can be, you can be, I should even remove ceremonial from that, just magician or a magic practitioner. So you can be a Wiccan, a pagan, a ceremonial magician, a Freemason, a mystic, anyone who engages in some sort of ritualistic spiritual practice would fall into this. And I guess my origin story there is that I decided to get a degree in psychology because I was interested in magic and wanted to see what psychology could tell me about it. But once I got into grad school and started diving into it, I was a little disappointed that there wasn't some like grand unified theory of ceremonial magic. And of course, why would there be? That's a pretty niche topic, and psychology is interested in answering some of the bigger questions. But looking back, decades later, I realized that while a lot of psychological studies may not deal specifically with magical practitioners, and that you don't have someone getting real-time brain imaging on someone while they're doing the lesser banishing ritual or something like that, there are actually a lot of studies of human behavior and human psychology that do pertain to what we do. There's research that talks about how our posture, whether we're kind of sitting back like this or whether we're leaning forward, gives us a sense of passivity or power. And of course, in a ritual, we may assume, various magical gestures. And so if, this the posture can affect your state of mind, it's reasonable to think that the magical gestures that we do can do the same. There's research that talks about how people who put on like a doctor's coat and glasses don't just feel smarter, but they actually become smarter. Whether it's kind of erasing their awareness or whatnot. So again, if putting on a doctor's lab coat can make you do that, how does putting on a magical robe or going skyclad, if that's your tradition, how does that affect your state of mind? It's reasonable to think that there is a similar sort of effect. And so what I've done is kind of collected these things that pertain to what we do as magicians and kind of unpack some of the psychology behind it. And my approach or my kind of, I think my fundamental thinking about this is not that all of this is happening in our heads, but that what we're doing manipulates our state of consciousness in such a way that gives us access to these liminal states. And what happens in those liminal states, I'm not going to try to explain or second guess. If you're a materialist, you might conclude that that liminal state is fundamentally all psychological. But if you're a more spiritual bent, you might think that that liminal state is actually accessing some larger part of the, spiritual universe. And that's, again, not a question I'm going to try to answer. I'm just saying that the psychological techniques of ritual magic make that easier, make that happen.
Yeah, and there was a lot of a lot of that developed, um, maybe not to that extent, but the idea of incorporating psychology as a burgeoning science into the way that we analyze magic was huge. Late 19th century, early 20th century. Dion Fortune wrote a lot about it. I think she called herself a lay practitioner of psychiatry or psychology. Regerty also went on, to for studies in psychotherapy, and but I think Crowley was one of the first to really talk about the psychological nature in quite an open way. He just kind of pulled the curtain back, and in a characteristic manner. But uh, I'm curious, having read so much of his work, do you think that he did it appear that he took a strictly psychological model, or do you think he had a little bit more of a middle ground as well?
I think that evolved. If you read his an initiated interpretation of ceremonial magic, which was an essay that appeared when he published the Goetia, he presents this idea that the 72 demons of the Goetia actually just represents aspects of our own psyche that we are projecting and that we are kind of encountering, kind of this idea of reintegrating part of ourselves. He doesn't use that language, but he kind of posits a psychological model. But he comes around to later think of spirits having a actual separate existence. And a lot of this has to do with his revelations around Aiwass, the entity that dictated the book of the law to him, because it turns out there was information in that book that Crowley did not know or have access to, and that convinced him that this information came from something other than himself. And so, in a similar way, his opinions and ideas about did spirits have an external existence evolved over time.
Mm.
And it kind of
Yeah,
went from that psychological model to the more, no, these dudes really exist.
yeah, yeah. Much to my surprise, but it's I think that's one of the things that kind of made me have a little bit more empathy as well as like now finally being an author myself. You think to yourself like, oh, I've been kind of judging, and it's a rookie move. But sometimes we have this predisposition to judge the whole of a person's ideology based off of something they wrote, not understanding exactly what you're talking about. Like the work evolves over time. And especially if this person, any particular commentator or author, has been at work, for decades, you would really need to read as much of that as you can in order to get any real picture of the person and where they have arrived at. Um, and it's exciting to see now you've got the Psychology of Ritual Magic, Mind Over Magic, as your latest release. Does it figure into any of the other stuff, the biographical stuff that you've recently written about over the last 2 years or several years, or is this kind of a standalone project in a different milieu or different voice?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a standalone project. In a lot of ways, it's me kind of coming full circle on my journey in academia,
Mm,
because I, again, came into this interested in magic, didn't find those answers, but then I kind of found that wait a minute, there is, again, I guess as we were talking earlier, there's a puzzle here. There's something to unravel and solve a mystery. And I feel like I kind of solved that mystery. So after, 30 years as a psychologist, I'm like, wait a minute, there actually is a story here to tell. Invariably, a lot of my examples I give in the book do refer to Crowley, just because it's, you write what you know, and I'm looking for an example. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I'm very careful to try to cite people from other traditions and other authors and so on. So, because this is not strictly about polemic magicians or ceremonial magicians. It's about anyone who engages in a ritualistic spiritual activity.
mm. Yeah, that's I think that's wonderful. And it's super exciting because you're you're saying you've kind of arrived at an answer and a story here, so that's pretty juicy, like
Yeah, no, it felt really good to
yeah.
write this book. And again, it's in a way, I've had some people say to me, "Oh, this is kind of different for you," and I'm kind of like, "Well, this is all me," but I guess it's just a different me than has come across in some of the more historical stuff I've done.
Mm, mm. And when does that come out? That's not out yet, right?
The official release date is October 7th,
Okay.
but the book has been printed. It's in the warehouse, and apparently people who have pre-ordered directly from Inner Traditions have also started receiving copies.
Oh wow.
So I'm like super excited. I've seen a few people posting on social media, I got my copy, but dying to hear what people think about it because it is a little bit different from what they may be used to from me, but never no less, scholarly or academic than what I do. It's just a slightly different angle.
Mm. Well, obviously, it's as we mentioned earlier, it's a little bit of an introductory interview, and these conversations tend to shift gears at breakneck speeds, just in general, So, but to kind of pivot a little bit, I did want to go back to something we mentioned in the beginning. You gave such an interesting, like profoundly interesting presentation uh, at Mystic South on sex magic and the history of Victorian sex magic, which was it, and it's virtually impossible for me to really contextualize the overarching theme of it because you know just saying that, oh yeah, Richard gave a really compelling presentation on sex magic is not going to communicate the level of absurdity and hilarity, and just it was a wild ride, really. So, I mean, was that something that you had to prepare a lot for? Did you just kind of already have those pieces available? I mean, what's your interest there?
Well, I mean, obviously the idea of sex magic is something that's central to Crowley's magical thinking as well. And as it turns out, Crowley was not unique in that respect. The short version or the elevator pitch for that talk is basically that this idea of sex and spirituality going together was just in the water, was in the air, was everywhere at that particular time. And that's probably not unique in history either, but people tend to say, oh, this is, Crowley was really into this. And it's like, well, it's not just Crowley. It was like a lot of people. And I wanted to explore that concept as well. One great, great source of that um, that's kind of inspired me on this path was Jocelyn Godwin's The Theosophical Enlightenment, because there was like a chapter in there in the beginning that just talks about the Victorian literature on phallicism, this idea that religion is fundamentally inspired by the worship of a generative power. And, and the idea that, phallicism is not referring to a phallus in the sense of a penis, but phallus in the sense of procreative ability, which both men and women have, but that this is the original impetus for all religion. And for Crowley, arriving at that realization was a big turning point. And I was kind of curious to kind of follow that up. And this is something I do hope to write more about. My books seem to have kind of been almost like this. I think of them as like a retrograde trilogy, and that I started off writing the biography of Crowley, and then the book I wrote after that was Forgotten Templars, which is saying, well, okay, Crowley did this magic stuff, and he became the head of the Ordo Templi Orientis. Well, where do Ordo Templi Orientis and Ordo Templi Orientis come from? And so I started looking into that backstory of, German Freemasonry and the, high degree rites, and particularly the more esoteric and unusual rites, of which John Yarker was a notable champion. And and now I'm kind of at the point of like, okay, well, Crow was big into sex magic. That those ideas were in the OTO. Or did OTO get that stuff? Where did these ideas about sex magic come from? And so it's if someone doesn't beat me to it, I want to write the third book in the retrograde trilogy, kind of looking at just how this idea of sacred sexuality and sex magic, it was literally everywhere, and kind of just lay out, all the places where we can find it in 19th and 20th century occultism.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in the talk is that there is this widespread kind of belief that the Victorian people were sort of disinterested in sex when in reality they were clearly obsessed with it,
Very
but
much so.
I just couldn't, they had a hard time talking about it. Everything had to be like innuendo and things like that.
We
Yeah.
must cover up the table legs because legs are too sexy.
Yeah, it's that kind of absurdity that I'm talking about, in the actual history itself, which is
Yeah.
it's quite impressive, and it does make the psychology of the history. It makes it very compelling because there's an element that is so familiar, you know, the human sexual nature and how it is something that is unavoidable. In fact, is it can be dangerous to avoid that kind of stuff. It can be a source of dis-ease or unhealth. But at the same time, so different. And like we're just very, things that they did, the lengths that they went to, are unthinkable to us nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think one of the first, I think my first comment to you, I came up and I was like, wow, man, I had no idea, but these people were all like batshit crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think about, Crowley reviewing, um, like Emma, like Edward Burrage's books on Thomas Lake Harris or um, Ida Craddock,
Mhm.
and making this remark that if you read these works and you think they're filthy, it's because you're filthy. This is actually profoundly spiritual.
Mm.
But the idea of kind of turning those tables and saying, if you think this is filthy stuff, that's on you.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And another thing that I really enjoy too about just your overall approach is that you are really an occult historian. I feel like you're just as conversant in the Golden Dawn history, and those figures. You just mentioned of Edward Burrage and his studying of Thomas Lake Harris, and that was a whole controversy for people like myself that love the Golden Dawn between him and Annie Horniman, and then she ends up getting kicked out. And meantime, she's been supporting the Mathers for 2 decades. So it's just really it's cool to incorporate all that stuff. Part of me wishes there was like a mini series or like a movie just about that little group of people, but I'm not sure it'll ever be done.
Yeah, no. Chapter in that on that book when I get around to writing it for sure.
Yeah. Sell the rights, man.
There
So
was
you
actually some of this. There was a play called The Golden Dawn that some local people in the Detroit area put on. I mean, these are like academic folks, but it wasn't about Edward Burrage and the sex magic stuff. It was just this really charming sort of story about the Golden Dawn circa 1898 to 1900, and characters were like William Butler Yeats and
Mhm,
Annie Horniman and Florence Farr and Crowley, of course.
mhm.
Um, it was quite cute, and I don't know whatever happened to it. I remember going to the premiere and talking to the authors, of the play, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Um, so you are also a practitioner in the Thelemic tradition, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and that's not something that you shy away from talking about.
Not particularly. Typically, I will present myself as one or the other,
Mhm.
because if you're trying to present yourself as a serious scholar, there's a tendency to discount the scholar if you feel like, oh, they're into some weird shit. But at the same time, I don't know, it's a big sort of controversy, particularly amongst a lot of European academics,
Yeah.
that this idea that you can be a scholar of Western esotericism but not a practitioner because somehow there's this whole emic versus etic
Right.
perspective,
Comes up a lot.
and it's kind of like an open secret. Most of the people who are into that are actually practitioners, but publicly they're kind of like, oh no.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, and I
no,
respect you.
so my desire is not to like undercut my credibility, but I also find that no one makes a fuss if a rabbi writes a book about Judaism, or if
Right.
a Christian writes a book about Christian mysticism. But for some reason, if you're an occultist writing about occultism, it's like no, no.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. I'm going to use that. Yeah, so I mean, how has that shaped your journey. I mean, because this is a forum that I try and cultivate so that we can share in that middle ground and talk about how the two sides of serious study, either of the history or of the material itself, can coincide with the practice. Just to kind of maybe give you a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about is my own time and many of the people that I assist through the process of going through the Outer Order of the Golden Dawn. It can be a very life-changing experience in a lot of ways. Some good, some bad, but but always life-changing. And so I'm wondering because from what I understand from the OTO rituals, are vastly different from the Golden Dawn to a degree, and so. I'm interested, we don't have to go into details about what's in the actual rituals, but I'm interested to know, like, what was that trajectory like for you? Was it were you an automatic believer? Did you have to in these forces, or did you have your own kind of evolution going from the psychological to the more mystical?
Well, I guess there was an evolution that happened, and my impetus for wanting to join OTO, for example, because I had been a solitary practitioner for about 10 years before I joined, and part of the reason for that was, again, kind of harkening back to when I was getting interested in this stuff. This is in the 70s, and we had, Marcella Moda, Kenneth Grant, and Grady McMurtry all claimed to be the head of the OTO, and I was just like, I'm just staying out of this mess. And it was actually when I started studying the biography of Aleister Crowley, his life story, and I got my hands on these court papers, the transcripts of this trial between Marcella Moda and Samuel Weiser, Moda was one of these, again, claimants to be the head of the OTO, and he was suing Weiser for publishing what he thought was his intellectual property, the Crowley material, basically. And what wound up happening is in court, Grady McMurtry and some of the other people who are part of Agape Lodge, this was like the last functioning OTO body at the end of Crowley's life, the folks out in California, all realized that after Crowley's successor, Carl Germer, had died, that the order had kind of stopped. And they all got together, the surviving members of that lodge, and restarted the organization. And once I read that and kind of understood what was going on, that to me felt like, okay, this is where the continuity is happening. It's not some guy coming out of the woodwork claiming to be the head of the order, however sincere or whatever he may have been. But I realized that this group was the real deal. And I was interested in experiencing the actual magical system of Crowley, not just reading about it, but actually to go through it. And and so that's why I signed up. And by virtue of a lot of my studies, I kind of went through those ceremonies, and while they were moving and powerful experiences, the real, like, blow off the top of your head stuff came a little bit later for me than from that very first introduction. But blow the top of my head off, it indeed it did. And yeah, my purpose in being involved in the organization really is just to be like, I think of it as like I'm a candle in the window. I want to be able to help these experiences, these transformative experiences, to be available to other people. Much the same way you said that, as you help usher people through the Golden Dawn rituals, sometimes it's greatly transformative in a positive way, sometimes not so much, but it's the work that you believe in, and I'm kind of here for the exact same reasons. I think Grow System is cool, and I want it to be available for other people who think it's cool. And it, may not be for everybody, but that's great because there's Golden Dawn, there's Amorc, there's all sorts of other things out there. And it's just for the people who want this, let's make it available.
Yeah. Very, I find that admirable. And because I know, I know, I know the cost of, to some degree of being, taking on that position of responsibility that is particularly administrative in some capacity. It's certainly, um, it's a sacrifice. And so, but somebody did it for us. So it's like you got to pay it forward, really,
Yeah,
in some
yeah, yeah.
respect. I have a lot of respect for that.
Well, likewise.
Um, One thing, just again, selfishly, and you and I didn't really get to talk about it too much, but
Now's the time.
yeah, yeah. Music, music. You're a keyboardist, right?
Yes.
Okay. You play, I'm assuming you're trained on the piano, or have you always just
Piano,
kind of,
yeah.
so there's always this kind of thing with the occult, particularly with Crowley and like, coming through the arts and through music and things like that. Did or does now, right? Because you still play, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I don't play anymore, so I will live vicariously through your stories. But
Okay.
but does that dovetail with your magical practice at all anymore? Or let's put it this way, your spiritual life?
Hmm. I mean, yes and no. Um, I wouldn't say that it's a particularly, okay, how can I say this? The music that I do isn't particularly magical in nature. I'm a big fan of the progressive rock genre.
Hell yeah.
So in the 70s, that would have been bands like, Genesis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes, and going on Marillion and modern days Porcupine Tree and
Oh yes.
Opeth
My
and things like
favorites.
that. Um, and for me, the appeal is having a much wider palette of sound and arrangement than because this genre borrows from everything, borrows from classical and jazz and folk and everything else, and odd time signatures and blah, blah, blah. And then incorporating synthesizers and keyboards, and get different textures than you would with just a guitar band and such. And, escaping the tyranny of the 4/4 beat. um, and that's what appeals to me about that. But I in my mind, there's a connection there because um, progressive rock is one of these sorts of heady sorts of things. That's not that's you to really appreciate. You kind of it does help to have some idea of music theory and be able to count the meter and go, oh, this is kind of cool what they're doing here. But also the lyrics are kind of famously not just love songs. I mean, there are love songs in prog rock, but they tend to have more high concept things that they're writing about. And that suits me in the sense that I think my whole approach to life is to do things that make other people think. And whether that's through writing or through playing this, sort of heady sort of prog rock stuff, the idea is get people to think. So in a way it's connected, but not in a like a direct or obvious way. I don't necessarily like write songs about magic or anything like that.
Mm.
Um,
I've always looked at, so I love prog rock. I cut my teeth on that. Porcupine Tree is one of my favorite
awesome.
bands. I spent 3 hours this morning listening to King Crimson. But,
Oh
but
yes, I forgot to mention them. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I've always seen, from my vantage point, I've always seen the Golden Dawn tradition, right? Meaning Golden Dawn, Thelema, Alpha Omega, Stella Matutina, all the sort of derivatives. I've always seen that style of magic as like prog rock because they do, like you're saying,
Yeah.
all of the memorization, all of the learning of the Hebrew, the learning of the symbolic vocabulary. It's like learning your scales, learning your modes, and then going out there and doing something truly magical with it. Prog rock to me, particularly in terms of like a live format, it captures that lightning in a bottle a lot of times. It's part jam, it's part fusion. There is a magic that, and it's a group magic that's really occurring. So
Yeah, yeah.
I,
I remember seeing the Yes Union tour, which was like the great, coming together of all the members back in like '89 or so, and they played the song Awaken, and it was, just between the music and the lights, it was truly a transcendental experience. It was just, I can't even begin to explain what it was like, but I'm sure other people have had similar experiences with music, but that was just
yeah,
a peak moment, yeah.
yeah, that theatrical flair that we love too.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess, yeah, that's true. Again, as I was saying, that, oh, prog rock borrows from classical, jazz, folk, Golden Dawn borrows from Enochian and the Chaldean oracles and blah, blah, blah. So it is kind of this synthesis of disparate things and to give you a wider menu of things to choose from so that your practice, whether it be music or magic, isn't confined to like one note or one genre or one
Mhm.
style, but that you have this whole big world to choose from. And that's what I love about this whole Golden Dawn system of correspondences.
Mhm.
It it really works better than it has a right to. If you just took a bunch of random stuff and try to cram it together, like what the hell are you doing? But then you look at it and go, wow, this actually these things line up. This really does work and it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like that's miraculous, and Crowley just kind of took that and built his own edifice on top of it. But, without the Golden Dawn, there is no Crowley.
Mm. Well, this is so much fun for me. But obviously, I want to be respectful of your time. I want to give you the opportunity to mention anything that you might have forthcoming. We talked about your book. We talked about October 7th. Are you giving any talks? Are you doing any classes? Have you got anything coming up?
Not at the moment. I actually had, a big blowout of talks this past summer between Mystic South and the National OTO conference here in the US, and things are kind of quiet. I'm now kind of in support mode for Lynn, who's giving a talk at the Witch Summit in Phoenix in a couple of months.
Nice.
But, with Mind Over Magic coming out, I'm kind of getting ready to start doing interviews like this and just help people become aware that that book is out. But soon, I'll be turning to new projects. Um, and never a lack of ideas there. We talked about how one of these days I want to write this, this history or the backstory of sex magic and Western esotericism. I'd like to get my book Forgotten Templars out again. There's just some of this discussion about those, the ancient and primitive rite and the Cernil rite and all these things, which are kind of the backbone of a lot of of what John Yorker passed to the OTO is pretty obscure history, even for Freemasons. And there's a lot of stuff. I've had people who looked at this and said, well, I've never seen this before or that before. And I like to get that into people's hands as well. So yeah, no, no lack
That's
of ideas of things I want to get to once I have
yeah,
a moment to breathe.
that's exciting. Yeah, the John Yarker stuff too. There's a lot there just in general. So I'm looking forward to that. Everybody gets a canned question on the show.
Okay.
So could you recommend for this evening's listeners three books that could sort of rope them into a few of the things we talked about tonight? So either Crowley or psychological models of magic, the broader Thelemic tradition. Three books.
Gosh, that's tough. I don't want to just like refer people to my own books.
You can because here's the thing. That's what most guests do. No shame there.
I mean, if it's about things that we've talked about, it's because I've written about them, so it's
Right,
kind of
right.
tough. But there is a book I wrote called The Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley, and when I was asked by Wiser to write this book, the marching orders I was given was think back to that 14-year-old kid who just picked up that copy of Magic and Theory and Practice and didn't understand a thing about it, and write the book that you wish you had then. And so I think for people who are curious about Crowley but who don't know really where to start, that's kind of a good place because it talks a little bit about the magic stuff, but also has a little bit of biography and talks a little bit about the various groups that he's associated with. Um, for psychology, again, please pick up Mind Over Magic. I think it'll be a very different sort of book. It's very evidence-based and has a lot to offer. And another book I will mention because you are talking to or have talked to Londiket is his Magick of Aleister Crowley, because he goes through Crowley's rituals and not only presents the rituals or republishes them together in his collection, but he talks about how to go about doing them. And one speaks from just this wealth of knowledge and experience, and it makes doing some of these but fundamental rituals a very easy thing to do. And so if you want to approach Crowley from a more practical standpoint, I can't recommend that book highly enough. And I feel bad 'cause there are so many other books and people that I could refer to, but
Well,
you said three.
yeah, you blame it on me. I say
Yeah.
three. Well, Richard, thank you so much for taking some time out to talk to me tonight. It's absolutely a pleasure, man, and I hope to see you
Well,
again soon.
I hope so. That's anytime.